if you open a book about the famine, or as I note in the book, like Rick Steves' Guide to Ireland, you'll see, or any number of papers in the biological sciences about the biology of either the potato or the blight mold, right? The water mold, the P. infestans. You'll see often the idea that in times of abundance, Irish workers ate anywhere from 10 to 14 pounds of potatoes a day. And it's just not true, right? It cannot be. It's one of those things I don't have evidence. And, I've had to, I don't have evidence that this is not true, but other than common sense.
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. In this episode, Canadian historian Padraic Scanlon joins me, Frank Armstrong, to discuss his book, Rot, A History of the Irish Famine, which explores the modernity of Ireland's experience with potato cultivation. The crop was subjected to the dreaded Blight, Phytophthora infestans in 1845, which caused a famine until 1851. He reveals how Ireland became the guinea pig for British colonialism of the late 19th century, aspects of which linger to this day. Thus, the staggering inequality, pervasive debt, outrageous rent-gouging, precarious employment, and vulnerability to changes in commodity prices that torment so many in the 21st century were rehearsed in the Irish countryside before the potato failed. Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. We are delighted to welcome Padraic Scanlon, author of Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine, which was published by Hachette in 2025. Thank you, Padraic. Where are you joining us from, firstly?
So from my basement in Toronto, Ontario.
And you are a professor of history in the University of Toronto?
Yeah, so I am associate professor at the University of Toronto. I teach in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. So it's an interdisciplinary unit that focuses on work and employment. So I'm trained as an historian, and before I joined the University of Toronto, I taught in a history department. But I'm the historian in a department that studies work from a bunch of disciplinary perspectives.
Great, and your name suggests an Irish ancestry.
Yeah, so I'm from Montreal, Quebec, and I'm not entirely sure actually why my parents opted to kind of dial up the Gaelic in my generation. But yeah, my dad's family are descended from immigrants to what would have then been, I guess, Canada East in the 1850s, right after the famine. And my mother's family are Quebecois.
Okay. And the name X, is that? Am I getting?
Yeah. So there was a question about whether or not. My parents, before I was born, my brother's, 11 years older. And before I was born, they had moved from Montreal to Windsor, Ontario, which is right on the border with Detroit, Michigan, right on the American border. And my mom was really, really homesick and moved back. And I think had ambitions of transforming my brother, who had basically grown up in Ontario, into a real Quebecois product. And I think she wanted to name me François Xavier instead of, and so the X is Xavier. Yeah, it was left over from another possible name, so I could have been François Xavier Scanlan.
Well, my name is Francis, originally, there must be a Xavier in there too. But moving on to your book, it displays a rare level of engagement with the nature of the potato plant itself. did you cultivate varieties while you were writing the book? Do you enjoy eating potatoes? Or do they remind you of what occurred in Ireland in the
I mean,
1840s?
I do like potatoes. I mean, who does? I mean, most people do, I guess. They're pretty. I have to say, I didn't really do much more than very experimental attempts to actually grow potatoes ourselves. But I'm pretty interested in the kind of granular details of agricultural work when it comes to historical scholarship. So I was interested in methods of cultivation, tools for cultivation, and I wouldn't count out trying to grow some potatoes on my own. But yeah, no, I enjoy potatoes, and I would like to try to grow them seriously, but we haven't really fully succeeded.
Well, you come to Ireland and it's simple to grow potatoes. I don't
It's
know,
growing down.
maybe that's one of maybe the fact that it's a non-native plant means that there aren't predators, or maybe that explains why it has done so well. Then again, it didn't do so well for a while either, and we continue to be blighted by the blight, Phytophthora infestans. There are regular warnings on the news in Ireland about blight in the air, so it hasn't gone away. But you suggest that Basque fishermen brought the plant to Ireland. How do you think this happened, and what made the potato particularly suitable to Irish social and environmental conditions of that time?
Sure. I mean, one of the lines that I try to draw out and rot is to kind of figure out exactly what it was about potato cultivation in Ireland that made the potato in Ireland so exceptional, right? And it wasn't the widespread cultivation of potatoes, because that was, more or less prevalent across a lot of Western Europe, right? After the Columbian Exchange, after potatoes were brought back across the Atlantic from the Americas. But there are a lot of myths, I guess, or legends about the arrival of the potato in Ireland, and a lot of the stories have to do with some prominent English nobleman, being gifted or deeded land after conquest in Ireland, and then bringing the potato with him, and setting up a market garden, and then kind of spreading the gospel of the potato among the Irish peasantry. But I think I'm borrowing here from other historians, but I think that a more convincing account is that Basque fishermen on their way to fish the Grand Banks off the coast of what's now Newfoundland would call in Ireland to pick up food and water, especially water, before making the final trip across the Atlantic. And so I think it's pretty plausible to think that they certainly brought potatoes with them as food. And it's plausible to think that, the potato arrived in Ireland through that route. But I guess it's also possible, like with any kind of sort of ecological invasion, although it's not, or ecological introduction, right? It's possible that there were multiple introductions of the potato. But in any case, I think in Ireland, as in a lot of Western Europe, it was pretty clear pretty quickly to a lot of peasants and small farmers and agricultural laborers that this was a crop that was really versatile and that could serve as a backstop against famine and against hunger when other crops failed. I think the difference in Irish history is that the specific political land settlement and political economy after British conquest ended up creating a situation where what had once been a backstop crop became first a staple and then a kind of hyper staple, right? A staple that was upon which people depended so completely that it was really, people depended on the potato all across Western Europe, especially in Belgium and the Netherlands, but nowhere I think was that dependence quite as profound as it was in the Irish countryside.
Yeah, I recall in France, I don't know if you're familiar with Parmentier.
Sure.
The story of how he persuaded the French peasantry to eat potatoes.
Yeah, and they still leave. You can still leave a little potato on his grave in the as
okay.
a little thank you.
The story I heard was that that people, the peasants weren't eating potatoes in France in the 18th century until well, the end of the 18th century. He was captured by the Prussians, probably in the 7 Year War, and held in prison for a few years, where he survived exclusively on potatoes. And when he returned to France, he thought it would be a great act of benevolence if he could persuade the French peasantry to also eat potatoes. So he organized for them to be grown on the outskirts of Paris, and he asked guards to circulate during the daytime and to guard, and then to withdraw at a point when they were ready to be
Right.
harvested. Just so it seemed as if they were something
Sleep at the
exclusive.
switch, right? Yeah. I wonder if that's true, right? Like there is, I think that there is a certain, I feel like there's a certain narrative there that's not dissimilar to the idea that like Sir Francis Drake brought the potato with him, right? I wonder whether, I mean, I think that people, once you could figure out that it would grow so readily and that it was so easily edible. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Parmentier definitely. There's also, I think, an apocryphal story that he put on like potatoes 30 ways or something, and that Jefferson went. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris at the time and went to this kind of gala dinner introducing the many ways of cooking and eating the potato, and that Jefferson was especially taken with kind of deep fried potatoes and then brought them back to Monticello as the French fry. But whether or not that's true, I have no idea. But it does speak to this kind of look at the novelty of it, right? It really is like a crop that in Europe at least is has a really complicated intellectual history in the Enlightenment, and then takes a kind of different turn after the optimism of the Enlightenment starts to fade away in favor of a more kind of deeply pessimistic Malthusian perspective on the relationship between food and population. So, it's the potato is at the center of those debates in the 18th century and at the 19th century. And once you start llooking for it, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean it's a wonder crop, isn't it? I mean, when you compare yields of potato to wheat, as you do in your book, I mean it's extraordinary. I think you mentioned that a family of six could survive for a year on 1 acre of potatoes, along with their livestock, which is incredible. So in Roth, you emphasize the modernity of the Irish experience with the potato. Can you speak a little bit about the Irish rural economy at that time?
Yeah. So, the book really traces the history of the famine of 1845 to 1851, beginning more or less in the early 18th century, although most of the action of the book takes place in the decades right before it and right after the arrival of the late Blight pathogen in Ireland, in 1844, 1845. But yeah, the potato, as I see it, was a kind of paradoxical crop, right? Because it both provided, at least in years when the weather was good and when there weren't pests or pathogens, really remarkable yields that could support fairly large families among the Irish rural laboring class or the Irish peasantry. Although I'm a little iffy as to whether or not we can actually call Irish laborers at this time a peasantry, but can just. And so when I say that, I'm just kind of shorthanding it.
Well, okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think because one of the things that I was interested. So before I worked on the history of the potato, the potato famine, I worked on the history of British slavery and anti-slavery for quite a long time. And one of the big questions that I was interested in that era was the question of what constituted a peasant, because it's a word that was used very often by both anti-slavery leaders in Britain and also prominent slaveholders in the Caribbean and also in Britain in the decades after the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 and before the abolition of colonial slavery in 1833. And it was a kind of argument where the abolitionists were saying after slavery, after emancipation, formerly enslaved workers will become peasants. And then slaveholders were saying, no, enslaved workers are peasants, right? They're a contented peasantry, right? Was one of the common phrases used to kind of defend plantation slavery in those decades at the beginning of the 19th century. And neither side were referring to anything that at all resembled what I think economists or political economists today refer to when they refer to a peasant. That is to say, like either like a rural smallholder or a long-term tenant on agricultural land who grows food both for subsistence and also for the market. And that wasn't at all what abolitionists were referring to when they were thinking about the post-emancipation Caribbean, and it wasn't what slaveholders were referring to either. And so I'm a little scared. So it's something that was used in Ireland as well to say like the Irish peasantry. But, I think after the Cromwellian invasion in the 1640s, and then the invasion led by William III, first William of Orange, and then William III in 1689, beginning in 1689. It's a lot of Irish land was redistributed, right? Taken from Catholic aristocrats and redistributed either to Catholic aristocrats who are willing to convert in order to continue to hold on to their lands, or to, the various military officers and adjutants and financiers and assistants and noblemen who assisted in those two conquests, right? So a lot of the basic structure of Irish landholding was transformed in the late 17th and early 18th century. And so, the people who were working for wages or sometimes for access to land to grow potatoes instead of wages, right? Looking at at the time of the beginning of the famine, 1845, probably like 2.5 million people out of Ireland's roughly, almost 9 million population were people who you might say they were peasants because they lived in huts, basically on poor agricultural land. They grew potatoes for their own subsistence, but at the same time, they didn't own the land that they worked. And they did not have any of the kind of, historical roots of other European peasantries. Like it's not like the potato cultivation was such a relatively recent phenomenon in Ireland that the arrival of the potato and the redistribution of land after British conquest really transformed the political economy and the structure of Irish rural life and work. And so I don't think it's fair necessarily to say that, other than the fact that the Irish rural working class had, crude, like low technology tools, few capital inputs, right? Like the question about whether or not they were peasants, I think obscures the fact that, they were not working in a kind of ancient system that had survived into the 18th and 19th centuries. They were occupying a pretty new role within a very modern economy within both the British Empire and the United Kingdom as a whole. So, I think calling them peasants kind of misses what was really happening.
So, I suppose they're commonly referred to as the courtier class. And it's only 2.5 million people. Well, only, but it's not like at the eve of the famine, there were 8.5, maybe more people in the country. Can you give us an idea of what was the level of reliance of the people beyond that 2.5 million of the courtier class, the labouring underclass? How would the famine have affected them?
So I think in a couple of ways. I think first of all, one of the things that I tried to bring out in Rot is the degree to which the land economy in rural Ireland on the eve of the arrival of the Blight and the beginning of the famine was shaped like a pyramid, right? And in earlier drafts of the book, there's a kind of like Ponzi scheme element to it, although it's not literally a Ponzi scheme because there is an underlying product, right? It's not just a robbing Peter to pay Paul. But it is a case of a relatively small number of aristocratic landlords who then lease out land to into an increasingly, to layer after layer after layer of tenants, right? So in England, right, the average, when in English history, when you refer to a farmer in this era, you're not thinking about somebody who actually works the soil themselves, right? They're somebody who has a relatively large amount of capital and makes a pretty complex financial arrangement with an aristocratic landlord, and then employs agents and laborers to work the land, and doesn't rely entirely on rent, on rent paid to them in order to pay their own rent to their landlord, right? So if you're a farmer in England, part of it comes, like, you pay laborers and maybe you have subtenants, but that rent isn't everything that you need in order to pay your own landlord, because the produce that your farm produces and that you sell, or access to water, any of the other kind of any of the other ways that you might make money from a farm, helps to fill out that margin. But in Ireland, right, for many tenants, the amount of total saleable produce produced on a farm didn't come close to meeting the rent obligations that were required to continue to maintain tenancy. And so, that meant that collecting rent from subtenants was necessary in order to maintain your own hold. And so consequently, right, there is a bottom of the pyramid who are most vulnerable to the failure of the potato, but the whole system is precarious, and it doesn't take that many years of bad harvest or bad luck to slide down the ladder, and it's much more difficult to climb up it, right? So it's a pyramid that is pretty difficult to ascend, and that is constructed out of pretty fragile materials. And so, the people who were most vulnerable to starvation were the people at the bottom. But that didn't mean that vulnerability didn't extend upwards. And, one of the things that, I think one of the things that really killed people in the course of the famine was less starvation itself, although certainly thousands of people did die of starvation. It was more of infectious diseases that circulate readily in periods of subsistence crisis. So diseases like, dysentery, influenza, especially typhus, right? And those diseases could kill people regardless of where they were on the social hierarchy. And so you have this strain, like this kind of effect where the kind of most conspicuous deaths in the famine are among the very poor, and sometimes among the relatively wealthy, right? The kind of the sort of urban middle class, or the like among priests or famine relief officials who are circulating among people who are infected with typhus and become infected themselves. And so you have this, there's a precariousness to the entire system. And then in the midst of the crisis itself, there's an epidemiological kind of leveling of the social order.
Interesting. But then there were also, in the aftermath at least, what we kind of petty bourgeois, peasant, whatever you want to call it, farmer, or strong farmer, as they're termed in Irish history, who did seem to do quite well out of it. Is that although I mean, the marriage age goes up, doesn't it, and the opportunities for redistributing the land change, because in a pastoral setting compared to a more tillage setting.
Yeah, but it doesn't resolve. Sure, there are definitely, right, there is a group of, right, one of the lines, I think one of the moves that I try to make in the book is to show the way that the structures of a pretty sort of transparently colonial conquest in the 18th century were ostensibly erased by first the Acts of Union in 1800 and 1801, and then by the Catholic Relief Act in 1829, right? That ended, right, by that kind of ended, at least officially, the kind of colonial trappings of British rule in Ireland, but that those structures weren't erased, right? So that there's a way that those, and you can see, and in some ways that was helpful to a certain tranche of the Catholic middle class in Ireland, right? The people who were graziers, right? And the reason why the Catholic middle class, when they were making money, made it in grazing was because that was a kind of loophole within the penal laws that restricted Catholic access to land and, restricted the kind of financial rights of Catholic landlords and Catholic employers in the course of the 18th century. And it meant that if you were making money as an Irish Catholic member of the middle class, you probably made it by grazing cattle. And so the depopulation of the Blight caused by the famine after the arrival of the Blight, and then mass emigration didn't change the basic the basic system of land holding or the structure of land holding in rural Ireland. That didn't change really until the Land War, the 1870s and 1880s and beyond. But it did change the way that the pressure of population sat on land, and it allowed for the expansion of grazing without changing the system of land tenure. And so there were people who...
And the expansion of farms. Farm size.
Yes. Yeah. Farms could be larger. The basic farms could be larger. And on a larger farm, right? One of the moves that Irish landholders and larger farmers had been making since the 18th century was a quite nimble flip back and forth between tillage and grazing, depending on markets in Britain and the state of market. So as demand rose for beef, right, you could convert more land to tillage. If demand rose for oats or wheat, you could convert land to grain. But generally, right, the movement was much more towards tillage than towards much more towards pasturage than to tillage, right? But that nimbleness and that ability to flip between one product and the other was something that was established in the 18th century and accelerated in the 19th century, right? Mm-hmm. So in a way, like, it wasn't like the structures. I think one of the things about confronting this history is understanding that some of the features of British rule in Ireland and some of the features of the structure of the United Kingdom benefited the Irish Catholic middle class after the Blight, right? So it's not like it's not a single story. I mean, I think there are loads of British villains, right? And I think there's something like quite villainous about the structure of extraction set up in Ireland, but that didn't mean that it was universally oppressive to every single Irish Catholic, right? And there were some people who did quite well out of the structures that were put in place by British rule in the 18th century, in the course of the 19th century.
Yeah, it wasn't, I suppose, unlike the 18th century, the 19th century wasn't an era of overt anti-Catholicism.
No. Yeah, I mean, and it turns out actually that like the absent France as a great Catholic rival, in the 19th century, there was an absent, Spain and France are no longer the rivals to British power that they had been in the 17th and 18th centuries. And, I think in general, Victorian Britain was a fairly officially religious society, but it was definitely a secularizing society. And so, anti-Catholicism no longer, I mean, there are plenty of anti-Catholic tropes. And in some ways, like, anti-Catholicism becomes a phenomenon in the United States much more than in Britain, right? Like the know-nothings and like the anti-Catholic riots. So in a way like that conflict is exported, but it decreases in like there are definitely ultra Tories, but they are no longer in the political van like they were in the 18th century. And you can't really win. You can't win arguments anymore by invoking, popery as something like hanging.
Yeah, the religious tensions only really kind of ramped up again, I suppose, the end of the 19th century when home rule became a possibility. But they had disrupted the United Irishmen, the foundation of the Orange Order in 1795 and all of that. And that may have been orchestrated by the British state. So it's, so they were, it remained a vehicle to kind of harness, the loyal kind of Protestant minority who were vital to maintaining Britain's power. So just moving on then, English administrators bemoaned that Irish farmers didn't work as hard as their British equivalents at that time. Was this true? Was it a land of milk and potatoes?
Yeah. I mean, no, right? It's not true, right? Like it's that I think is one of one of the things that I've received a little bit of flack for on the book is my kind of like technical definition of colonialism and the argument that like Ireland is subject to colonialism but isn't a colony, right? At least in a meaningful, at least in the kind of technical sense. And I think like if you read past the first 5 pages of the book, you'll see that argument is much more sophisticated than but whatever. It's neither here nor there. But I do think that there is a way that the one of the ways that Ireland is seen through a colonial lens is through the association between the kind of Irish difference from whatever Britishness is and its relationship to labor. And that's really consistent across the British colonial empire everywhere, right? The idea that, for example, like people of African descent in the Caribbean won't work without coercion is something that comes straight out of slaveholding, right? And is a myth invented to justify mass enslavement, but even after emancipation becomes a kind of colonial trope about how, formerly enslaved laborers in the Caribbean need to be educated in wage labor because of their, I guess, like ostensibly natural tendencies towards sloth, or because of the legacies. Like that's like the scientific racist version of it. And then there's the more kind of like culturally chauvinist version of it, inflected with racism, which is that, formerly enslaved people in the Caribbean need to be educated in the discipline of wage labor because mass enslavement did such cultural damage to their ability to control themselves. Right. And so those are colonial tropes throughout the British Empire. Like the idea of how the idea of the British bourgeois as the kind of idealized, self-motivated, hardworking pinnacle of economic civilization is something against which the whole world can be measured, exists throughout the British colonial empire, and it definitely exists in Ireland, where the idea of the apparently relative ease of growing potatoes becomes proof that, like in a sense, like one of the things that makes British colonial officials skeptical of crops like potatoes and also cassava, tubers in general, is that they're too easy to grow. And that being too easy to grow, they provide food too readily. And providing food too readily, they don't instill the appropriate level of discipline that's required to kind of move up the ladder of civilization from a kind of like Edenic existence where you're just digging potatoes out of the ground and eating them to a more refined, more civilized existence where you grow crops that require a division of labor, right? So one of the things I try to bring out in Rot is the distinction between wheat and the potato in the imagination of British political economists. And the potato, right, there's a lot of work that goes into growing potatoes, although the work is more controlling pests and, in the mode of cultivation that was practiced a lot in rural Ireland in kind of maintaining lazy beds and manuring. And like there's plenty of labor that's involved. But ultimately, right, you can take a finished potato, like out of the ground, boil it and eat it. Yeah. And that seemed to British political economists, and from ranging across the political spectrum, from like William Cobbett to Harriet Martineau, that seems suspicious, because wheat, right? You have to sow it, you have to plow and sow, and then you have to do all the work of protecting the crop from pests and predators and birds, and then you harvest it, you thresh it, you dry it, you store it, you grind it, you mill it. You know what I mean? And then finally you sell it, right? And so there's all these steps between sowing grain and eating bread, and so far fewer steps between planting a potato set and eating a potato. And that seemed to be evidence of a kind of lack of civilization amongst the people who ate potatoes as their staple, and B, of kind of like decivilizing effect of growing potatoes at all. So, when William Cobbett was writing in the first decades of the 19th century, he was appalled that people in Northumberland and Cumbria in northern England were starting to grow potatoes and starting to rely on potatoes, because it seemed to be a kind of like it seemed to him to be a kind of cultural devolution in the English countryside. And so there's a really strong association between what you eat and how you grow what you eat, and what at least the British imagination of a kind of imagined hierarchy of human civilizations, like what you eat and how you prepare it places you somewhere in that hierarchy, and eating potatoes puts you quite far down in that hierarchy. And there's all kinds of other ideas that flow from that about the Irish appetite for potatoes, about the consequences of eating potatoes, about whether or not potatoes are, nutritionally adequate, or, there's all kinds of like knock-on effects of that basic assumption about food and civilization.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the potato, in political terms, it lends itself to a kind of anarchism almost, because people can live like pretty much without access to a grain mill, without access to even ovens, without access to stores. Yeah. You can see why, even just unconsciously, why a ruling class would be very resistant to this crop.
And it cuts across both sides of the political spectrum, right? Like Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon writes about how, he describes the French peasantry who supported the monarchy. He's trying to explain in that history, right, why it is that the French peasantry sided with the monarchy, even though ostensibly their class interests ran against the monarchy. And Marx's solution to it is that they're like potatoes in a sack. That's the image he uses. Like they're like potatoes in a sack, right? They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. So even for like socialism and like mid-19th century communism, the potato is associated with a lack of sophistication that is that makes people who eat potatoes easily manipulated and easily swayed by the power of the throne. So it's a really potent political symbol.
Well, I suppose that's quite different again to the Irish depiction, because the potato seems to make them less easy to rule by the crown, but it's interesting, actually. Yeah. You argue that Ireland was a testing ground for British colonialism, although you've nuanced that a bit. So where have you observed this being applied? Are there other colonies where you can see how the Irish system was applied, or is it that obvious?
So I think it's more that Ireland was the first. Ireland in some ways has a very complicated, not in some ways, like the Irish relationship to British imperialism is really complex. Because Ireland is
the Irish people were often behind the butcher's apron as
exactly, right. But it's a kind of I think the like a good example, right, is to keep on going back to the Caribbean, which is always lurking in the background in terms of the way I think about history, just because of my but I think if you look at the way that on the other side of the Atlantic, right, in the Caribbean, where Britain is ruling over, an empire whose most of the population are enslaved in the Caribbean, right, and the white population is pretty small, and in the Caribbean, the differences between Irish Catholicism and British ultra-Toryism evaporate in the face of the threat of armed revolt by the enslaved labor force, right? And so there's a way that the Caribbean becomes like, and the empire in general is a place where the Irish become agents of British imperialism and British colonialism. But back in Ireland itself, the Irish countryside is subject to the exact same forces, right? So there's a way that Ireland is both, within its borders, very much within the kind of zone of control and exploitation and command of the British Empire, while at least the Irish, professional classes play a very prominent role in the expansion of those same forces of exploitation and command around the world. And so there's a way that Ireland becomes, in the course of its relationship to Britain, the object of all kinds of experiments in how to govern the empire, right? I don't think there's any other colony that is governed quite the way that Ireland is governed, insofar as Ireland is within the, there are lots of other models of British imperial governance, but Ireland is really important as a testing ground for the expansion of the empire in general, right? It is one of the first places that has a fully, I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but that is a part of the British Empire for a very long time, in a way that, and so consequently is subject to, but also at the same time a participant in wave after wave of innovations in how Britain governs its empire in the course of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and finally ending in the 20th century.
Well, just the English laboring, the English rural laborers weren't treated that well either in the 18th century, were they?
No, of course not. No, and I also think like one of the elements of, I mean, like in general, the agricultural world of the United Kingdom, and first the United Kingdom between the Act of Union and Ireland's independence, the real wages for agricultural laborers fall everywhere, right? Like the countryside is not paradise for workers, even in England, right?
Yeah. And you had the enclosures in the 18th century in England.
But the vision of it's like a kind of like imagined version of the English countryside is very useful rhetorically, right? So there's the idea of the landlord once a year. You could see this again and again. I've seen it a whole bunch of times in writings about Ireland in comparison with England, when people are, in the first decades of the 19th century, before the arrival of P. infestans to Ireland. Like English observers are trying to determine what is different, right? And one of the fantasies of the English countryside is of this kind of patriarchal, familial relationship between landlord and tenant, and then between tenant and laborer. And whether or not that bore any resemblance to reality is, I think, pretty dubious, right? There were, the huge agricultural riots in England in 1830 and 1831. But it's very useful, right? And then the comparison in Ireland is, the landlord is an absentee. The farmers are not themselves prosperous enough to be able to extend the same kind of patronage to their own subtenants. And so, I think there's a kind of hopeful strand of agricultural reform that imagines that the way to solve the deepening crisis in the Irish countryside in the decades leading up to the Great Famine is by reinvesting in landlordism, right? To try to transform the landlord class into a more open-handed, investment-minded and present class, right? Which is, I think so. There's and that argument relies on a fantasy about what the English landlord class was like. To say that the rural squire that could be kind of brought to Ireland and exert the same kind of pacifying effect on the countryside. I mean, that doesn't happen. It doesn't really happen in England either, but it is something that, people who have no real experience of the English countryside are happy to invoke in arguments about the Irish countryside.
Yeah. Okay, so just moving on, do you think the famine has left a major imprint on contemporary Irish society that you can observe, and or the diaspora of which you're a part?
I think it has had a profound effect on the diaspora, right? I think that in some ways the famine is the founding event of the Irish diaspora. I mean, Ireland was a country of immigrants long before the Blight itself, but it was still, I think, like, if you look at here in Toronto, in Montreal, where I'm from, there are memorials to the famine on the Erin Quay here, which is where one of the Billy Bishop, the city airport, is. There's a famine memorial in Ireland, in Montreal. In Griffintown, there's a big black rock that was put up by laborers, right, who emigrated from Ireland to commemorate people who died of typhus on the way over. I think that there's a sense in which the famine is the founding event of the history of the diaspora. And it's kind of where Irish history stops for a lot of people who are in the diaspora, right? Like there's, my and it's definitely not where Irish history stops in Ireland, right? So I think if you just think about the geography,
the irony is in Ireland, it's a large. I wouldn't say it's ignored, but it's not something that people are, discussing very much, or.
I mean, you can think about it.
Scholarship has probably been a bit weak on it until recent times. So.
I mean, I think you can think about it in terms of the, like, just thinking about the physical space of the National Museum of Ireland History and Decorative Arts in Collins Barracks in Dublin, which has, a display on the ground floor of some really good stuff from the era of the famine. They have especially agricultural implements, which a lot of them were not made of metal, and so a lot of them did not survive. So they have some good objects that are of historical importance, and they're well displayed. But it's about the size of, like, a supply closet, basically. And then there is a floor on the Civil War. And it makes sense because in terms of the politics of contemporary Ireland, the Civil War is much, much more important than the famine. Now, the famine obviously has, like, the enormous and increasingly wealthy Irish diaspora after the famine has its role to play in the Civil War, right? Just as it had its role to play in the War of Independence. But it's the support from the diaspora is different than direct participation in the conflict. And so I think there is a gulf, I think, between the understanding of the famine among the Irish diaspora and the famine in contemporary Ireland. And what it means is very different.
I'm also just in terms of legacy, I'm thinking, one would be sort of the trauma, the collective trauma, not just of the victims and their families, but the people who would have seen what had happened, and this sort of survivor guilt and that sort of thing. But also, and maybe this goes back to before the famine, the point you make about Irish people having to be very aware of price changes and, property moves. And, you look at contemporary Ireland and there's a sort of still kind of a bit of an obsession with property and a sort of pathological relationship with it. And I wonder whether that can be traced back to the points you're making about kind of this kind of mentality that this precarious that existed prior to the famine.
I mean, that's possible. Yeah, I think that there is definitely I mean, if you asked, right, I think, like, owning a home, right, is a incredibly I mean, it's in Canada as well, right? But especially in Ireland, right? Like,
Yeah. I think in Ireland we had the highest rate of home ownership until before the last crash in the OECD, which
yeah,
suggests people are really kind of sort of obsessed by that. Whereas Europe today, you see people renting for life. It's not such a big deal.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
changing now, of course, but
yeah.
something to we could talk about that for a long time, I'm sure. The whole relationship with property in the neoliberal era and its relationship to labor. um, but could Ireland have fed itself if exports had been halted? Is that a realistic assumption?
That's a good question. Maybe, I think, is the best answer. But I also think it's one of those questions, right? That I try to, I think that cuts to a kind of disciplinary question for historians, right? Which is that, I think, and as I said earlier, right, I work in an interdisciplinary department where a lot of my colleagues are quantitative social scientists who are interested in labor economics or in supply chains or in collective bargaining, all of the kind of technical details of work and employment. And one of the questions that they often ask when I present my own work is like, well, what's the relevance for the present? Or what if X had been true, would Y have been true? Those kinds of like more sort of social scientific questions about the past. And so I don't like, it is possible, I guess, that so Daniel O'Connell and a group of other allies presented a plan for famine relief to the Lord Lieutenant right at the beginning of the crisis in 1845. And I think it's a testament, as I try to bring out in Rod, I think it's more a testament to the respect that O'Connell commanded in Ireland and also in London, that he even got the meeting and that the Lord Lieutenant said, okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for your input. Because the plan involved, shutting Ireland's ports, closing exports of grain, and then selling that grain at cost to people who needed it. And from our perspective in 2026, right, you might say, well, that maybe it would have been better to just distribute the grain for free. But selling that grain at cost seems to make sense as a more credible and plausible plan for famine relief than importing 200,000 pounds of cornmeal from the United States in order to prevent that people in Ireland had never eaten, much less grown, and using that as the stopgap food, right? That sounds ridiculous on the face of it. But then when you think about the circumstances of the politics of the United Kingdom at that time, it becomes easier to understand that, like, Daniel O'Connell's plan would only have been possible in the United Kingdom in the year 1845 with a revolutionary change of government, right? The idea of closing the ports in 1845, right on the eve of the end of the British Corn Laws and the beginning of the free trade in grain, was just completely impossible. Right. It would be, I think you have to kind of think about what some of my political scientist colleagues sometimes call, in a kind of clunky phrase, the horizons of possibility, right? For a particular political system. And in 1845, the idea of closing the ports might have worked, but it would have required the violent overthrow of the British government in order to actually have a government.
And that leads on to the next question. Then why didn't the Irish people revolt in greater numbers to achieve that end?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly it's hard to have a revolution when you're starving. Yeah, I think that's the main thing, right? I think that's something. So,
although wasn't the French Revolution an extended bread riot?
That's true. Yeah, but then you had a big city, right? There's no. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm no expert on the dynamics of revolutions, but I think there was plenty of, I think there wasn't really despite the, Daniel O'Connell's monster meetings, right? At Clontarf and all these places, right? Despite those kind of big shows of, you might get 20,000 people at a rally outside of Dublin, but there's still, 9 million other people in the country, right? I think you see it. And then I think in some ways, like maybe for the moment for an armed, the moment for a rising isn't like the young Irelanders, right? Who led a kind of doomed revolt in 1848 in the midst of the famine really did not pick their spot particularly well, because I think they imagined, from the comfort of London and Dublin, that they would be able to kind of just harness the anger and the frustration and the starvation of the of the countryside in order to, really quickly overthrow British rule in Ireland and establish God knows what, right? Like a sister. Really, I mean, I think what Smith O'Brien wanted as the leader of Young Ireland was radically different from what O'Connell wanted. But what their real desire, what their war aims were in that doomed rising, I don't really know, other than to kind of like be like Italy, be like Hungary, be like the other.
Probably would be more like Haiti.
Yeah, exactly, right. But I mean, I think that would not have been. Yeah, I don't know is the answer, but I think part of it has to do with it takes a lot to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like going back to the 1790s when the French arrived in Mayo, they were very disappointed that the peasantry weren't willing to rise up, and the places where the United Irishmen were most successful tended to be in urban areas, actually, and mixed religious populations, in places with a certain threshold of material threshold.
Yeah.
If you're illiterate, it's difficult to organize people who are.
Also the vision, right? The vision, like who knows what the vision of, like I think in some ways, like the vision of what Ireland was supposed to be, that Young Ireland represented, was pretty different from what most people in the countryside would necessarily. I'm not sure that they had necessarily had. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like it's really hard to say, but I think we tend to maybe overestimate the ease of overthrowing a government. I think it's like British rule in Ireland was, in the end, in the War of Independence, proved to be pretty fragile.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they did spend more on security than famine relief in that period, from 1845 to 51. So, like, they were, there would have been a significant obstacle to achieving independence.
Yeah, yeah.
And the War of Independence, that came at the end of World War One, and Britain was under pressure and on multiple fronts, and there was a whole kind of international audience that was sort of impeding sort of coercion methods, that you wouldn't, like 1845, if there'd been an uprising, I mean, it would have been horrific, the treatment.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I think there was a lot of violence in the Irish countryside, but it tended, and there was a lot of, the generic term that the British government used is outrages, right, which to refer to crimes against property in rural areas that seem organized, especially when they seem organized, right? So there are obviously plenty of secret societies that are at work in the countryside. There's lots of crimes of opportunity. There are riots. There are seizures. There are examples of people, of the British Army having to support, send troops to guard grain barges moving down the rivers, right? There's a lot of military activity and a lot of violence in the countryside in the course of the famine, but it is much more, I think, from, again, I'm no expert on the dynamics of violence really, or of revolt, but I think that a lot of that violence is oriented around like desperation for food rather than any kind of political program other than survival.
Yeah, so we're going to have to wind up in a little while, in just a couple of minutes, Rita. we haven't had time to talk about the Gregory clause and how this led to Irish people losing, if they got any famine relief, they would lose their land. But just to you took issue, just on another subject. You took issue with Irish historians accepting accounts of Irish peasants eating 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes per day. Why do you think? Or, I mean, why do you think this is misleading? And why would these accounts have been given?
Yeah. So I think that is, yes, that's my favorite chapter of the book, the people's potato. So there is, if you open a book about the famine, or as I note in the book, like Rick Steves' Guide to Ireland, you'll see, or any number of papers in the biological sciences about the biology of either the potato or the blight mold, right? The water mold, the P. infestans. You'll see often the idea that in times of abundance, Irish workers ate anywhere from 10 to 14 pounds of potatoes a day. And it's just not true, right? It cannot be. It's one of those things I don't have evidence. And, I've had to, I don't have evidence that this is not true, but other than common sense, right? Which is that, I spoke to people at the factory.
Yeah, you talked in the book about how people who were eating that, in experimental conditions, were eating that amount of potatoes would suffer from severe digestive issues.
Yeah, it's too much, right? You just can't eat that much. You just cannot. You could do it. Like you could, if you wanted to eat 10 pounds of potatoes one day, you could do it you could certainly do it without dying, but it wouldn't, you couldn't do it every day. And the idea that Irish laborers, or Irish men, at least male laborers, did it every day, is, I think, just in an earlier draft of the book, kind of got cut when I was editing it. But, I think I've found the origins of that, right? A couple of people said something similar to a parliamentary commission. And then, the parliamentary commissions published their work in these monster blue books, right? That are thousands of pages long. And very few people, except for me, have read all the way through them. But the kind of big hits of every blue book would often be published in a much shorter pamphlet. And so I think that that's part of the way that somebody just says it offhand, and then the thing that can't be true becomes the thing that is true about the Irish appetite. And then I think it's repeated and repeated and repeated because it's so pungent, right? Like it just seems to express, for historians who use it now, it's meant to shorthand something that is absolutely true about the Irish economy, which is that a lot of people in Ireland ate almost exclusively potatoes and ate a diet that was probably the most monotonous diet in Western Europe in the 19th century. But that doesn't mean that they ate it in monster quantities. And the quantities, I think, speak to, and I don't think that historians are doing this in the present when they repeat that, like some kind of zombie fact. But in the 1840s and 1850s, when this idea started its meteoric rise, it was meant to express something about a different biology among the Irish rural working class.
Savages.
Yes, exactly. Right. And you could see it too in India, right? Indian peasants were described as having an appetite for rice that would kill a European, right? There's a certain sense that there's something kind of like animal about the Irish appetite for potatoes that suggests a deep affinity, like a kind of biological affinity between the Irish and the potato, that suggests a sort of like perverse difference, right? And so I think it, in a way, like that helped to, it complicated the question of how to respond to the loss of potatoes, when a widely circulated idea about potato consumption was that, like
I suppose there's less compassion for the death of beasts than
sure, and also just like, well, what are you going to do? Like, what are you going to do with a people who not only depend on this decivilizing and uncivilized crop, but also eat it in quantities that are so vast that even like a bountiful harvest of this crop won't meet their appetite, right? There's a sense that the freakishness of the Irish appetite for potatoes complicates the way that famine relief rolls out, right? Or at least the way that someone like Charles Trevelyan, writing his pamphlet, The Irish Crisis in 1848, I think I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, "What hope is there for a nation that lives on potatoes?" Right? The idea being like this, and yet at the same time, right? There are these two big dichotomies, or these two disjunctures in the way that the British Empire metabolizes Ireland's relationship to the potato. And one way is there's this simultaneous, right, that there's a way that the potato is both the root of all of Ireland's problems, right? And the use of root puns is everywhere, right? Everybody loves to make a root pun. They're the root of all evil. They're the root of, you know what I mean? Like it's irresistible. But at the same time, the potato makes possible an quite productive Irish agricultural economy that supplies Britain with livestock and meat and grain, with very low inputs of capital, virtually no inputs of technology, and pretty low wages. So the potato both makes the system work, but also seems to represent the system's imminent collapse and fragility. And at the same time, there's the same sort of view of within Britain of Ireland. That's one of the kind of big themes that runs through the whole book, which is the way that Ireland seems to observers to be ancient, right? They look at, like, British visitors go and see they see the Irish countryside. They see these kind of old, kind of undulating fields of lazy beds. They see these old stone walls. They see like a picture of rural Ireland that is still kind of sold, as a tour, like as part of the appeal of visiting Ireland to tourists, right? This kind of untouched ancient countryside. But that untouched ancient countryside is very new. And so, Ireland was, in the 13th century, densely forested, right? It's just like a very different, it's not an ancient way of life. It's a very new way of life that is an adaptation to the pressures of an accelerating industrial capitalism in Britain, but that looks old. And so consequently, there's this kind of temporal misunderstanding of what is happening in Ireland that makes Ireland, like, when the Blight actually strikes, right, all of Britain's plans, all of the UK government's plans for meeting the crisis, they're expensive, right? The UK spends a lot of money on Irish famine relief. They're complicated, they're ambitious, but they're all premised on the principle that the Irish economy needs to be modernized, and that the Irish laboring poor who work in the countryside need to be brought into into economic modernity. But the point I try to make in the book is that they were already in economic modernity, and that's why the crisis happened in the first place, right? And so that's and so the solutions that are kind of like that are proposed for the Blight when it happens are solutions that are precisely the wrong solutions. They're solutions that only intensify the set of pressures that made Ireland so vulnerable in the first place. And I think you can understand that partly through the 12th, that's why I love that 12 to 14. I've spent a lot of time fiddling with that. And when I give the book talk, I have a 45-minute version of the book that I give as talks at universities. And it focuses on that as well. Because I think you can understand from that where that fact comes from about the Irish appetite. You can understand an awful lot about both the structures and the attitudes that made the Blight so catastrophic in Ireland in the first place, right? Because this is a crisis, right? The arrival of P. infestans, P. infestans hits Ontario, where I live. It hits Pennsylvania. It hits Peru. It hits northern Spain. It hits Prussia. It hits the Netherlands. It hits Belgium. It hits Poland. It spreads it hits England. Everywhere potatoes are grown, the late Blight spreads in the 1840s, and it's catastrophic to those crops everywhere. But it's only in Ireland where the Blight becomes a half-decade long apocalyptic catastrophe, and that's not because the Blight was more virulent in Ireland, or that it somehow became more virulent in the Irish countryside. It's because in Belgium, after the first season of Blight, Belgian farmers planted oats, with the collaboration of the government, right? The potato was a very important food for Belgian, like French-speaking Catholic Belgian farmers, but it wasn't the thing that held the whole system together in quite the same.
And it wasn't used as a way of clearing the land of
exactly
laborers.
Yeah, it was just a foodstuff, right? It was a very important foodstuff, and people died, right? Like people died of famine-related illnesses in that first season of Blight in the Netherlands, and there were food riots in Prussia. But it wasn't the same because the potato wasn't quite so foundational to the entire system of rural economics.
Yeah. Okay, Padraic, we'll have to leave it there. I think we could talk for a lot longer, but unfortunately we both have to go. So thanks a lot.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to cassandra.voices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.